$250,000. That's the fine my HOA just hit me with for violations on my own land. After 30 quiet years in this house, suddenly I'm being told I'm trespassing on community property. These million-dollar mansion owners with their manicured lawns and imported cars think they can bully a 71-year-old man into surrendering everything he owns. They picked the wrong old man. What I uncovered when I decided to fight back didn't just blow a hole through their little power trip. It ripped their perfect suburban fantasy wide open. You have not seen revenge this satisfying. Started on a Tuesday like any other. I was out back checking on my chickens when I heard the mail truck groan down our quiet street. Nothing unusual until I opened the mailbox. Thick certified envelope. Heavy paper. Return address in shiny gold. Sunset Hills Homeowners Association. That gold ink probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. My gut tightened. I knew it wasn't going to be good, but I had no idea just how deep this was about to go. I stood in the driveway turning that envelope over like it might bite. Across the street, Betty Harris waved. Morning mail. Bringing good news, Walter. If only she'd known. Inside was a violation notice that shot my blood pressure through the roof. The HOA was fining me $250,000 for 3 major violations. Illegal fence placement beyond property line, unauthorized structures in community setback area, encroachment on designated green space. I've been around long enough to smell nonsense from 3 counties away. This was premium hand-packed manure. That illegal fence? It's been in the same spot for 30 years. Exactly where my father put it, back when this whole area was farmland and hope. The unauthorized structures? My tool shed, my chicken coop, and the little wooden gazebo where my late wife, Jane, used to sit every evening. The encroachment on designated green space? My vegetable garden. I've been growing tomatoes there since before half these mansion owners knew what real dirt looked like. And that was just the beginning. Within 2 hours of opening that letter, here came Sophia Blackstone herself, marching across my yard like she owned the whole subdivision. And I mean marching. Designer heels, probably cost more than my monthly Social Security, clicked across my gravel drive. 2 other HOA board members trailed behind her like royal attendants. She clutched a clipboard like it was a scepter that could wave my house off the map. The look on her face said it all. Pure disdain, like she'd stepped in something foul. Mr. Harrison, she announced without so much as a hello. I'm here to personally document these violations before we proceed with legal action. She paraded around my modest property, pointing her polished finger at my fence, my garden shed, my coop. Violation of community standards. Encroachment on HOA-maintained land. Non-compliant structures. I watched her perform this little inspection and felt my temper building like steam in a tea kettle. She was telling me that buildings older than half this subdivision were suddenly illegal. I went inside, came back with my original property papers from 1973, and showed her exactly where my boundaries were. She flicked her manicured hand at them. Those old papers are irrelevant, she said in that flat, entitled tone people use when they've never had to prove a word in their lives. We have modern surveys showing community boundaries. You're clearly trespassing on HOA property. Betty crossed the street. God bless her, and said she'd lived there 25 years and my fence had been in that exact spot the whole time. Sophia smiled a cold little smile. You're both confused. The property lines were updated. If you don't comply within 30 days, we'll proceed with legal action, property liens, and, if necessary, a forced sale. Most people my age might have folded under that avalanche of legal threats and expensive suits. But I didn't spend 45 years as a surveyor around construction sites without learning how to spot a con. Something was very wrong. The violation notice cited a 2010 boundary survey as the basis for their claims, 5 years after these mansions were built. Why would you resurvey after the houses were already standing? As a retired surveyor, I knew a $250,000 fine meant you don't just grumble and pay. You lawyer up. I called my old friend Jim Patterson, who's done property law for 30 years. He looked over the violation papers, gave a long, low whistle and said, Walter, you need an independent survey done yesterday. This smells fishier than low tide. If you're right about your deed, we're not looking at a fence dispute. We're looking at something big. He told me to get a full boundary survey to prove exactly where my land ended and theirs began. That evening I went out to the garage and pulled out equipment I hadn't touched since retirement: GPS units, measuring tools, metal stakes, old-school surveying gear. The tools that had fed my family for nearly half a century. If they wanted to play games with property lines, they'd picked the wrong old man. I started with some preliminary measurements using my handheld GPS. What I found made my hands tremble. Not from age, but from a mix of excitement and pure rage. My fence wasn't off. It was dead on, right where the original corner markers should be, down to the inch. I grabbed my metal detector and began sweeping along the manicured edges of the mansion lots. One by one, I started finding the old iron survey stakes my father's generation had set, buried 2-3 feet under fancy landscaping. And that's when it hit me. Those old stakes showed my property stretching far beyond my current fence line. Far beyond. If the GPS and the buried stakes were right, then very expensive structures were sitting on land that legally belonged to me. I looked across at Sophia's massive place with its infinity pool and tennis court. Then at the 4 other palace-sized homes wrapped around my modest farmhouse. Maybe I wasn't the trespasser after all. Walter thinks he's fighting a greedy HOA. He's actually about to uncover one of the biggest land grab schemes his county has ever seen. And what Jake Miller finds under those perfect lawns is going to redraw the map of Sunset Hills. The next morning, I called Jake Miller, the best independent surveyor in 3 counties, and laid out the whole mess. I told him about the buried stakes, the 2010 survey, the timing. Jake went quiet. "Walter," he finally said, "this is the kind of thing that makes lawyers rich and homeowners broke. But if you're right, this is way more than a fence line. I'll take the job." We agreed on a comprehensive 3-week survey of my entire 8 acres. He was bringing everything: GPS base stations, laser instruments, ground-penetrating radar, the works. If someone was trying to steal my land with paperwork, we were going to answer with technology that doesn't lie. Week 1 was like watching a master carpenter at work. Jake set up his equipment with the precision of a surgeon. We used my original 1970s deed as our cornerstone, every measurement anchored back to that. We started at the property corners, comparing the legal description on my deed to GPS satellite data accurate within inches. Day by day, the evidence piled up. The GPS showed my property extending 50 to 75 feet beyond my fence in several directions. I hadn't just been fenced in. I'd been fenced out of my own land, which meant those mansions. Parts of them were standing on what legally belonged to me. By week 2, Jake's metal detector was finding iron survey stakes buried deep under flower beds and decorative rock. Decades of landscaping had been layered over them, almost like someone wanted them forgotten. Across the way, I watched Sophia pacing in her backyard, phone pressed to her ear, staring our way like we were stealing her crown jewels. One afternoon she stormed over, all charm and suspicion. "Are you properly licensed for this kind of work?" she asked Jake, her tone dripping with polite hostility. Jake just smiled, handed her his card, and pointed to the state surveyor seal and his 20 years of experience. Her face went from pink to paper white when she realized he was the real deal. The results hit like a freight train full of karma. Sophia's $300,000 infinity pool and tennis court? Every square inch sat on my side of the now-proven property line. Nathan Cross's pride and joy, a 4-car garage with a circular driveway straight out of a luxury car commercial, built entirely on my land. Elena Foster's $500,000 master bedroom wing with the spa bath and a closet bigger than my living room, on my land. Jackson Murphy's deluxe outdoor kitchen, pizza oven, and party patio, mine. And Bethany Wells' magazine-worthy front lawn, fountain, and fancy gazebo, all sitting on acreage my father bought 50 years ago. Jake just kept shaking his head as we marked and photographed each encroachment. "Walter," he said after measuring Sophia's pool, "in 20 years of surveying, I've never seen trespassing this massive, across this many properties. This wasn't an accident. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing." By the end of week 2, We documented over $2 million worth of construction and landscaping built on my 8 acres without my knowledge or consent. Every mansion had big-ticket additions crossing onto my land, some by a shocking amount. The final blow came when Jake dug into that 2010 survey the HOA kept waving around. He tracked down the firm that supposedly stamped it. The company had gone out of business in 2008, 2 years before the survey supposedly took place. The signatures didn't match any licensed surveyor in the state. The coordinates were mathematically impossible and conveniently shrank my property by pushing my boundary inward. Someone had fabricated an entire survey, company, signatures, coordinates, just to carve chunks off my land. And they'd gotten away with it for more than a decade. Betty turned out to be a crucial witness. She remembered the original construction clearly. Crews moving my fence markers and telling neighbors they were updating boundary lines for the new development. No one questioned it. They had uniforms, permits, and clipboards. People assume that means authority. Now, looking at Jake's data and comparing it to her memories, it all clicked into place. My father's carefully set boundaries had been deliberately shifted and buried, so these houses could sprawl over land that wasn't for sale. The third week felt like Christmas morning, every day. Instead of gifts, we unwrapped hard proof. Jake produced a 40-page professional report. Legal descriptions, coordinate tables, photos, GPS verifications, the whole legal arsenal. The conclusion was unshakable. I legally owned pieces of all 5 luxury properties. My decades-old deed outranked everything that came after. GPS didn't create new boundaries. It just confirmed what my father had already laid down. Property lines don't move just because rich people want a bigger yard. Sophia's panic was visible now. She hired her own surveyor, threatened to sue Jake, demanded second opinions, and started muttering about vindictive old men with faulty memories. But Jake's equipment didn't have an agenda. It measured reality. And reality was about to become very expensive for 5 of my neighbors. Walter now has proof measured in inches and backed by satellites. But evidence alone doesn't win battles. When a retired surveyor walks into a legal war with 5 millionaires, the next move decides everything. Echo Stories wants to know, are you following this from your own living room, your car, or your break room at work? Tell us where you're watching this unfold. Holding Jake's 40-page report felt like holding a lit stick of dynamite. The GPS coordinates, the deed references, the photos, anyone with working eyesight could see what had been done. But being right and winning in a courtroom aren't the same thing. I needed a specialist. Jim Patterson sent me to Jane Mitchell, a property attorney with a reputation for making crooked developers regret their life choices. Jane leafed through Jake's report, eyebrows rising higher with every page. When she finished, she leaned back and let out a sharp whistle. "Walter," she said, "this is either the biggest property rights case I've seen in 20 years or the clumsiest fraud in state history. But with these GPS numbers and your 1973 deed, I'd bet my license that you own every inch this report says you do." She explained it in simple terms. Recorded property deeds are the constitution of land ownership. They trump HOA rules, neighborhood covenants, even city zoning, everything. And my deed? Properly recorded, never modified, never challenged. All those HOA rules and shiny bylaws? They sit underneath it. Jane's research only made things worse for them. She dug up the original building permits and found they'd been approved using lot descriptions that did not match the county records. The permits had been based on falsified surveys supplied by the original development company. Different lot sizes, shifted boundaries, all magically making my land smaller and their lots larger. The county recorder confirmed my original deed was authentic, properly recorded, and untouched. Meanwhile, that 2010 survey at the heart of the HOA's case traced back to a shell company tied to the same developer. While we were building a legal fortress, Sophia launched a full-scale harassment campaign. Noise complaints about my rooster crowing at dawn. Apparently 6 a.m. is far too early for millionaires to wake up. Reports to code enforcement about my chicken coop being an agricultural use in a residential zone. A call to the health department claiming my compost pile was an unsanitary condition. Every day, a new certified letter, a new violation notice, a new threat. She threw the entire HOA handbook at me, hoping I'd cave and sell. She misunderstood one thing. Old construction guys are like cockroaches. We're hard to kill and harder to scare. Every letter she sent just pushed me further into the fight. Betty became my unofficial intelligence officer, watching which board members slipped in and out of Sophia's house for emergency meetings, reporting on the frantic phone calls she heard through open windows. The desperation was obvious. They'd built their dream homes partly on stolen land. Now the bill was coming due. Word of Jake's 3-week survey spread through the neighborhood. The place split right down the middle. The old-timers who remembered the construction nodded and said they'd always wondered about those adjusted lines. The newer residents, especially HOA loyalists, closed ranks, whispering that I was a senile old man making up stories because I couldn't accept change. Jake kept digging into the developer's history and found a pattern that made my stomach turn. Same tactics, 3 other subdivisions across the state. Fraudulent surveys, boundary markers quietly moved, HOAs set up to mask the land grabs. They targeted elderly property owners unlikely to fight long, expensive battles, then harassed them into selling cheap. I wasn't their first target. I was just the first one who'd spent 45 years reading property maps for a living. Sophia's next move was almost insulting. She showed up at my door with a cashier's check for $50,000. She smiled that tight, practiced smile wealthy people wear when they're trying to buy their way out of trouble. "Walter," she cooed, holding out the check. "Surely we can resolve this like civilized adults. This is a generous offer for a simple boundary misunderstanding." I looked at the check, then at her. "I don't take money from people who've been using my land for free for 15 years. I said. "If anyone's writing checks, it'll be you. To me. For rent." You could feel the temperature drop between us. A few days later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting about my ongoing violations and harassment of board members. Sophia was clearly hoping to turn the neighborhood against me before the truth went public. We were ready. Jake built a visual presentation that laid everything out in plain, undeniable images, maps, drone photos, GPS overlays, deed excerpts. No legal jargon. Just reality. The meeting was set for Tuesday at the community center. I spent the weekend spreading survey maps across my kitchen table. Same table where Jane used to serve Sunday dinner, and thought about what my father would have said. He always told me that owning land was one of the clearest lines between a free man and a serf, and that defending that line was worth every ounce of trouble. Tuesday would decide whether 15 years of quiet theft would continue, or whether one old surveyor with a GPS could remind everyone that justice doesn't expire. Walter has the data. Sophia has the microphone and the crowd. When they face each other in that HOA meeting, either the old man will be humiliated, or the queen bee is going to get stung. Tuesday evening rolled in fast. My hands shook a little as I loaded my briefcase and Jake's GPS unit into the truck. Not from fear, but from anticipation. After 3 weeks of measuring and months of harassment, it was finally showtime. The community center parking lot was overflowing. More cars than I'd seen at any HOA meeting since these mansions went up. People love a public showdown, especially when they expect to watch an old man get put in his place. Inside, Sophia had turned the place into a budget courtroom. A long head table for the 5 board members. Microphones. Projector ready to go. She sat centered, flanked by 2 polished attorneys with leather briefcases that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. The other board members, Nathan, Elena, Jackson, and Bethany, sat like judges at a trial. Nathan kept checking his Rolex. Elena shuffled papers. Jackson whispered to one of the lawyers. Bethany looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. I walked in with my old survey case and a GPS unit, took a seat in the back like I was at Sunday service, and waited. Sophia's opening act was polished propaganda. Blown-up photos of my violations. Slides of HOA bylaws. Their attorney warning of the dangerous precedent of challenging community authority. She painted me as a confused, stubborn old man sabotaging neighborhood harmony. Heads nodded along. People love a simple villain, and she'd cast me perfectly. Each board member took their turn. Nathan complained that my rooster disturbed his sleep, and that such farm noises were beneath the dignity of his four-car garage. Elena fretted that my vegetable garden attracted undesirable wildlife that might harm her delicate landscaping. Jackson called my tool shed an eyesore, dragging down neighborhood aesthetics. Bethany said my chicken coop raised safety concerns. Their lawyer wrapped it up by promising serious legal consequences if I continued my frivolous challenges. When Sophia finally called my name, the room went quiet enough to hear my joints creak as I stood. I walked to the front, calmly set Jake's laptop on their table, plugged it into their projector, and laid the GPS unit beside it like a scalpel on a tray. "Folks," I said, looking out at 25 pairs of expectant eyes, "I've been a professional surveyor for 45 years. Tonight, you're going to see the difference between accusations and measurements." The first image on the screen was a drone shot of the whole neighborhood with bright red GPS-verified boundary lines laid over it. You could hear the collective gasp. Those red lines sliced right through swimming pools, garages, master bedrooms, and picture-perfect lawns. The pretty illusion of where everyone thought their property was shattered in one slide. Next, I zoomed in on Sophia's place. Her infinity pool and tennis court glowed within my boundary, outlined in red with coordinates stamped along the edges. "Mrs. Blackstone," I said, letting it hang, "your $300,000 pool? That's my backyard." Her confidence drained out of her face in seconds. The next slide showed Jake's credentials. Licensed state surveyor, 20 years in the field, GPS certified, member in good standing of the professional association. Then, one by one, we walked through the neighborhood. Nathan's garage and sweeping driveway, entirely on my land. Elena's grand master suite, sitting squarely on my property. Jackson's gourmet outdoor kitchen, grafted onto my acreage. Bethany's front lawn and fountain, again, mine on paper and in GPS. Each encroachment came with coordinates, photos, and deed references. "No guessing." "No," he said, she said. Then I pulled up the 2010 survey they'd used to go after me, alongside Jake's forensic breakdown. We showed the dead company that supposedly filed it. The forged signatures from surveyors who weren't licensed or weren't alive. The impossible coordinates that magically shrank my property and expanded theirs. "Someone," I said, looking straight at the board, "created a fake survey out of thin air to make it look like I owned less than I do. And they've been hiding behind it for 15 years. Betty stood up from the audience and calmly backed up everything I said. How she'd watched crews move markers. How they'd told neighbors property lines were being updated for the new development. Other longtime residents chimed in, remembering the same thing. The room shifted, from skepticism to shock to anger, as people realized their HOA and developer had built a neighborhood on a lie. Sophia tried to claw back control. Her attorney attacked GPS as unreliable. I held up the handheld unit, turned it on, and Liv demonstrated coordinates matching the buried stakes we dug up, down to inches. They argued that old deeds didn't matter. My attorney explained, in very patient terms, that recorded deeds outrank HOA bylaws every day of the week. Sophia finally resorted to calling me a senile old man trying to steal their homes. I pointed at the glowing red lines on the screen. "Coordinates don't have opinions," I said. "Math doesn't take sides." The room exploded into chaos. Board members grabbed phones. Neighbors argued about what this meant for property values. Sophia shouted for order. I quietly packed up the laptop and GPS. I'd done what I came to do. The truth was out of its cage. There was no shoving it back in. The GPS lines are on the wall for everyone to see. 5 mansion owners just learned parts of their dream homes sit on someone else's land. Now the question is, how far will they go to protect those dreams? What Sophia does next might save her status or blow up her entire world. The morning after that HOA showdown, my phone rang before my rooster finished crowing. It was Jane Mitchell. "Walter," she said, "Sophia's hired the most expensive property litigation firm in the state. They're gearing up for war. This could drag on for months or years. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my late wife, Jane, who used to say some fights are worth it no matter the cost. "File whatever you need to file," I told her. "I'm not backing down." Jane filed a formal boundary dispute in County Superior Court, asking for a declaratory judgment on who owned what, based on my deed and Jake's survey. 48 hours later, Sophia's lawyers fired back. A countersuit accusing me of fraud, harassment, elder abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They threw every allegation they could think of, hoping something would scare me into surrender. The court fees alone were more than I'd spent on anything since my wife's funeral. But principle sometimes costs more than comfort. The discovery phase felt like getting root canals from lawyers instead of dentists. Both sides demanded documents, emails, survey files, permit records going back 50 years. I sat for hours of depositions answering questions about my memory, my motives, whether I understood the seriousness of what I was doing. They tried to paint me as confused and vengeful. They still couldn't explain away a recorded deed and GPS coordinates. By month 2, the media had caught the scent. Local news ran with the David versus Goliath story, elderly surveyor versus millionaire HOA board. Property rights groups called to offer support. Elderly homeowners shared their own HOA horror stories. Real estate lawyers from other states reached out about similar cases. I never planned on being a poster boy for property rights. But sometimes life volunteers you. The expert witness fight turned into old-school knowledge versus expensive spin. Sophia's team hired a surveyor who claimed GPS wasn't reliable enough for boundary disputes, and that traditional methods should override satellite data. Jake answered by bringing in GPS experts who explained, in plain language, how satellite positioning works, how accurate it is, and how his readings perfectly matched the original buried stakes. Math beat wishful thinking. By month 4, we hit the settlement dance. First offer, $50,000 to resolve this misunderstanding. Then $100,000. Then $200,000 for me to waive any claims on the encroached land. Each offer came wrapped in polite warnings about how expensive court could get, especially for elderly individuals living on fixed incomes. I gave them the same answer every time. I'm not selling you land you already stole. The bills piled up. I had to pull from savings I'd meant to leave my grandkids. When doubt crept in, I'd walk my fence line, stare at those structures squatting on my ground, and remind myself why I started. This wasn't about squeezing money out of anyone. It was about whether a recorded deed meant anything when rich neighbors wanted a bigger backyard. Month 6 was all legal chess. Motions about which evidence could be admitted, whether GPS counts as legally binding, whether Jake and other experts met every technical standard. The State Surveyor Association filed a brief supporting our side, arguing that GPS is now the gold standard for boundary surveys. Property rights groups chimed in, warning that letting wealthy developers override deeds would gut the foundation of ownership in this country. Sophia got more desperate. Her lawyers made one last offer, $2 million for my 8 acres, about 4 times its normal value. Walter, her lead attorney, said in our last settlement conference, "This is extraordinarily generous. It would be wise to accept and avoid the risk of trial." I looked at Sophia across the table, at the woman who'd once threatened to take my home, now terrified of losing portions of hers. "This was never about the price," I said. "My property lines don't move just because someone with money builds on the wrong side of them." By month 8, we were preparing for what the papers were calling the most important property rights trial in state history. Witness lists, exhibits, jury selection. The courthouse was bracing for crowds, cameras, and observers from every legal group in the region. Jake honed his testimony about GPS, ready to walk a jury from satellites in orbit down to the pins in my ground. Jane built a narrative from my father's purchase 50 years ago, through the fraudulent survey to the present mess. The night before trial, I sat at my kitchen table again, maps spread where Sunday roasts used to sit, feeling the weight of every acre. We were up against neighbors with more money than I'd ever seen in one place. But they didn't own the truth. We did. The battle lines are drawn, the media is watching, and an elderly surveyor is about to stake everything on a set of coordinates. In a courtroom, anything can happen. Witnesses wobble, evidence gets challenged, and money talks loud. The question is, will the math speak louder? Trial morning, The courthouse looked like a celebrity scandal, not a land dispute. News vans, protest signs about property rights, curious locals lining up early just to watch. I sat in my truck for a minute and wondered how a simple fence disagreement had turned into Harrison versus Sunset Hills headline material. But when I walked inside, my hands were steady. 45 years of survey work and job site showdowns had taught me how to stand my ground. Judge Margaret Chin presided, a 20-year veteran of property law, known for cutting through nonsense. Her opening remarks made it clear she knew this case would set precedent. This court will address the role of GPS technology in determining legal boundaries, she said, and the weight of recorded deeds against modern development practices. Sophia's team filled the front row, a line of attorneys in tailored suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere than arguing that satellites and public records were wrong. Their opening argument went like this: GPS can drift. Surveys can contain errors. Boundaries evolve through decades of accepted use. My claims were technically rigid and practically harmful to innocent homeowners who relied on professionals. They painted me as a confused old man using outdated legal theories to attack people who'd followed the process. Jane's opening sliced that apart. She explained how modern GPS surveying uses multiple satellites and ground control points to achieve inch-level accuracy, far beyond what was possible when my father first bought the land. Jake took the stand and turned the courtroom into a classroom. He pulled up GPS logs, explained control points, showed how his measurements matched the long-buried original stakes. He walked the judge and jury through why satellite data is now the industry gold standard. Then he dropped the bomb: his forensic breakdown of the 2010 survey. He showed how the coordinates didn't line up with any real-world plat, how the signatures belonged to people who either weren't licensed or were dead when the document was filed, how the survey firm had been dissolved years earlier. "Your Honor," Jake said, "this isn't a bad survey. It's a fabricated one, designed to make Mr. Harrison's property look smaller than it is." The room went still. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was fraud. Betty's testimony stitched the history together. She told the jury what she'd seen 15 years earlier: crews moving my markers, talking about updates, and new fences suddenly ending up where they'd never been. She had nothing to gain either way. That made her more believable than any paid expert. Then came Sophia. On direct examination, her lawyers kept it soft. She was a responsible HOA president, a victim of chaos caused by an unreasonable neighbor. On cross, Jane took that picture apart. How had she determined where my boundaries were without a legitimate survey? She couldn't say. Where did she get that 2010 document? "From the files," she said, but couldn't name who provided it. Why had the HOA never once spoken to me in person before slapping me with a $250,000 fine? No real answer. Finally, Jane asked point-blank if she'd known the survey was fraudulent when she used it. Sophia floundered. Half denial, half, "I don't recall." The jury saw it plainly. My own testimony was simple. I explained how GPS had changed surveying, why Jake's methods were sound, and how my deed predated everything around me. When Sophia's lawyer tried to paint me as vengeful, I looked straight at the jury. "I'm not trying to take anyone's home," I said. "I'm protecting land my father bought, using tools that tell the truth more precisely than anything we had back then." The jury deliberated for 2 long days. The media speculated, experts argued on TV, and we waited. When Judge Chun read the verdict, her voice was steady and final. The court finds that GPS coordinates, when obtained by licensed professionals and verified against recorded deeds, provide irrefutable evidence of boundary locations. Mr. Harrison's ownership of the disputed property is confirmed by a preponderance of evidence that cannot be reasonably challenged. The gallery erupted. Cheers from property rights advocates. Murmurs of shock from others. Sophia's lawyers huddled and immediately began talking about appeals. Then came the damage assessment. Each mansion owner owed compensation for 15 years of unauthorized use, calculated as fair market rent for the pools, garages, additions, and yards built on my land. And they had a choice: pay me ongoing rent to keep using my land, or remove everything they built on it. Sophia could either write checks for her pool and tennis court or tear out over $300,000 of concrete and tile. The others faced similar choices. Judge Chen's written ruling went farther than our case. It formally recognized GPS surveying as the legal gold standard for boundary disputes and reaffirmed that recorded deeds outrank HOAs, surveys, and understandings that come afterward. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into a new world. Betty was waiting with a mix of neighbors and supporters who'd followed every twist from the beginning. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but all I felt was a deep, quiet satisfaction. An old surveyor with a GPS unit had beaten money and manipulation with math and persistence. Justice landed hard. The coordinates held. Walter Harrison now legally owns parts of 5 mansions, and their owners either have to pay him or start demolishing what they built. But winning the battle is one thing. Living with the aftermath when millionaires become your tenants? That's a whole new story. A year after that verdict, I still wake up to my rooster Bob crowing over 8 acres of land that are, officially and GPS verified, mine, including the corners where millionaires built their dreams without asking. On the 1st of every month, the rent checks arrive like clockwork. I won't lie. There's a special satisfaction in depositing $2,000 from Sophia Blackstone so she can keep her infinity pool on my property. The same woman who once called me senile now writes my name on checks like it's a legal requirement, which, in her case, it is. Our rental agreements turned out fair. I wasn't out for revenge. I wanted justice and proper compensation. Nathan Cross pays $1,500 a month to keep his 4-car garage where it is. He grumbles, but rebuilding would cost far more. Elena pays $2,500 monthly for her master suite. The lease renews yearly. On paper, I'm the landlord for the most expensive bedroom in the county. Jackson pays $1,800 to keep using his outdoor kitchen for those fancy dinners. His guests now hear the story about his unique landlord situation almost as often as they hear about his wine collection. Bethany took the most principled route. She hired landscapers to move her fountain and gazebo back onto her true lot, at a cost nearly equal to 2 years' rent. Then she negotiated a $1,200 monthly lease for the strip of front yard she needs to access her own door. She told me she'd rather pay for access than admit she was renting part of her house. I respected that. She handled the whole mess with more grace than the rest of the board combined. Betty Harris has become my unofficial property manager. She helps coordinate maintenance on the rented areas and acts as a calm go-between when issues pop up. When Sophia's pool pump failed last spring, Betty brokered a cost-sharing deal that was cheaper for everyone and kept the peace. Betty's own vegetable garden now extends onto some of the land I reclaimed. We turned part of it into a community garden where neighbors can rent small plots for their own tomatoes and peppers. The local news still circles back every few months with, "Where are they now?" pieces about our case. Law schools teach Harrison versus Sunset Hills as a key GPS and property rights precedent. Jake's business exploded. Property owners from 3 states hire him for GPS boundary surveys now, especially the elderly who want their lines nailed down before someone tries to update them. I've been invited to speak at surveying conventions and property rights conferences. I've met more older homeowners than I ever imagined who've been pressured, harassed, or tricked by HOAs and developers. The pattern is depressingly familiar, but now they have a playbook. Get a real survey with modern tech. Dig up your records. Don't let anyone scare you out of defending what's yours. Winning the case changed my finances more than I expected. I upgraded to a safer truck, fixed up the house, set up a small scholarship fund at the local technical college for students going into surveying. But the best part isn't the money. It's the respect. Neighbors who once saw me as a cranky old man blocking progress now greet me as the guy who stood up and proved the truth. The biggest surprise has been Sophia. The rent checks and the courtroom beating seem to have taught her more about humility than decades of wealth ever did. She still lives in that mansion, still has the pool. But she's different now. Last month, she actually asked my opinion on a small backyard fence issue and listened. People change when they realize consequences are real. Every year, Jake and I run a quick GPS verification of the boundaries. It's overkill, but the neighborhood turns it into an event. Lawn chairs, iced tea, kids asking questions. Some newer homeowners have hired Jake to check their own lots. Minor encroachments and weird easements get discovered and resolved before they become the next Harrison versus whoever. Turns out, prevention really is cheaper than an 8-month court battle. The unexpected side effect of all this is a strange kind of shared responsibility. My tenants take good care of the structures sitting on my land now. It protects their investments and keeps our relationships cordial. I've learned more about pool chemical balance and tennis court resurfacing than any retired surveyor reasonably should. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing those expensive things maintained properly, this time with everyone fully aware whose ground they're built on. On weekends, I teach short courses at the community college about GPS surveying and property rights. The young folks see land surveying as high-tech now, not some old man with a tripod in a field. They understand that clear property lines are the backbone of economic freedom, and surveyors are the ones who guard those lines. My daily routine has a simple, peaceful rhythm now. Morning coffee on the porch while I look across yards that, on paper and in math, are mine. Evening walks along my boundaries, confirmed by satellites and court orders. The land my father bought, the home my wife loved. It's all locked in place for whoever inherits it next, shielded by a legal precedent that makes it much harder for anyone to pull the stunt again. From a $250,000 harassment letter to collecting rent from the very people who tried to push me off my own land, I learned something important. The best defense against bullies is knowing your rights and having the backbone to enforce them. My GPS unit and 45 years of experience turned into weapons sharper than any lawyer's threat. But more than that, this whole saga showed me that age isn't a weakness. It's an advantage when you use what you've learned. The real lesson isn't about satellites or survey stakes. It's about standing firm when someone tries to take what's yours, no matter how wealthy or powerful they are. Sophia and her board learned the hard way. Property lines don't move just because you wish they would. And sometimes the quiet old guy next door knows exactly what he's doing. Here at Echo Stories, we believe every David deserves a shot at beating their Goliath. Walter Harrison proved that experience, documentation, and stubborn honesty can beat money, pressure, and fraud. If someone's trying to take what's rightfully yours, land, a home, anything, remember Walter's approach. Document everything. Learn your rights. Don't let bullies talk you into surrender. If the story of precise revenge and hard-earned justice got your blood pumping, tell us what you think. Ever had to fight for your own property? Had an HOA or neighbor try to pull a fast one on you? We love hearing real-world David versus Goliath stories from people who refuse to back down. Until next time, remember, know your boundaries, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that being right isn't worth the fight.